Alright, here's part 2, everybody. It's time to look at the channels. We're going to start with exploring the primary channel mode, RGB. You have probably opened up Photoshop and wondered why different tones of black and white images represent the primary colors red, green, blue. And why, if you go into Photoshop, if you check display color channels in color, is it essentially a monochromatic image of red, green, and blue. Whether they're in black and white or color, these are used to represent the luminosity value of the colors. For example, you have your red, green, or blue. There is the actual color, and then there is the luminosity value. The luminosity value refers to how dark or light the color is. Now, it's time to explore the history and the science. Buckle up, we're about to travel back in time to the 19th century. The one thing to note quickly is, before we can get into the process of how this all-color photography thing works, we need to briefly talk about how black and white photography works. With black and white photography, we start out with a negative. The white parts of the image are actually the dark parts of the image, and the white parts of the image are the dark parts of the image. You make a print, whether that's on paper or metal, or if you project it, you wind up with a positive image. It's this tiny, tiny microscopic bits of silver that make up the image. Depending on how much of the silver got exposed to light, some less, some more, some parts will be darker, some parts will be lighter. It's these bits of silver with their different levels of brightness and lightness that make up the image. Your brain can't perceive all these tiny little particles, so it perceives a whole image. The device you're watching this right now actually lies on tiny little dots to make up the image, but we'll talk more about that later. Now with that out of the way, back to talking about RGB. That's right, the device you're watching this on right now uses RGB, which dates back to the 19th century. The device you're watching this on right now uses RGB, red, green, and blue. By displaying these colors at different luminosity values, we are able to reproduce a color image, or rather, the illusion of color. Now, with that introduction done, and with you guys buckled up, it's now time to travel back in time. In 1895, and meet James Clerk Maxwell and the photographer Thomas Sutton. You see, James Clerk Maxwell had a theory of how human vision worked, and he turned out to be correct. You can test this for yourself before I go into the example of how his color process works. His theorization is that humans couldn't actually see in proper color. Only colors we could see were red, green, and blue, and our eyes and brain mixed these together to form a proper color image. Check out this example. You can't tell what the colors are when the only light sources you have are red, green, and blue. It's not till you have white light, which is a mix of all of these three colors together, that you can actually tell what color the paint is. They didn't have electricity back then, so such a simple demonstration like this was not possible. Now, with that being said, let me show you how they went about proving this and demonstrate how their color process worked. So let's get into the next example. These were not taken with colored film. They were taken in black and white. You're wondering, how on earth was it accomplished? Let me set up a demonstration. My digital camera is set to take black and white images. I put on a red filter, a green filter, and a blue filter. To better illustrate, here's the same photo taken in color on my digital camera. Now, let's look at the channels. Let's take a look at my three black and white photos. That's right, they match the black and white tones on the channels. If I take these images, merge them together like magic, I have a color image. My green filter isn't quite green enough. It lets in other shades of light, which leads me into a other very important point about this process. That ribbon, the first color photo I showed you, it looks like that because that particular black and white color process was actually not all that sensitive to blue. They later started refining this to make it more sensitive, but if you look at old black and white images from the 19th century and the 20th century, that's because blue and white light capture at a very similar value. Over the centuries and decades, they would make great strides to making film that had better sensitivity to blue. It wasn't around to the 1960s they figured out how to do that adequately, but back to the demonstration. After taking the three negative photos, they would make a positive transparent print on glass, and then had a red filter, then the other one had a blue filter, and then the other one had a green filter. These three images would be projected onto the screen, producing a color image. This works because each of those luminosity values is unique. By capturing each of those luminosity values from each of those three colors separately, you're able to reconstruct the color. This process had some obvious drawbacks. The first one being you couldn't look at these images printed anywhere. Also, everything in the image needed to stay perfectly still. Otherwise, you would get color fringing. Let's move in to the 20th century and take a look at an autochrome. It's time to visit France and meet the Lumiere brothers in 1903. This process was invented by them, and it started to decline in the 1930s, and they stopped manufacturing it in the 1950s. This relied on a similar principle to the first method. Instead of projecting the image, it combined the colors and the luminosity values together. This was accomplished with potato starch dyed red, green, and blue. This process had four different parts. First was the glass, then the varnish, then the color screen. Sometimes there were gaps in between the starch layer, so they would brush in a little bit of lamplight to fill in the gaps. The varnish that went over the potato starch layer was used to protect it from the chemicals that would be used to process the light-sensitive emulsions on the back. And finally, the back is coated in a light-sensitive emulsion, using the same type of silver nitrate that black and white photography does. After everything was done, the plate was manufactured, the photograph was taken, we were left with a positive color image. A technology connection is the device you are watching this on right now uses tiny red, green, and blue dots at different luminosities to display a color image. That potato starch, like in the first example, blocked different wavelengths of light. Any of the light-sensitive emulsion that was blocked by, say, a blue bit of starch would only let blue light in. The silver nitrate that had a bit of red potato starch blocking it would only let in red light. A bit of silver nitrate that was blocked by the green potato starch would only let in green light. So each individual luminosity value of each of those three colors was captured separately. As you can see, the technology connection is a autochrome works very similarly to how your device screen works. I want to very quickly, without going into too much technical detail, mention a other color process, Technicolor. This is a British color process developed by Louis Defay. This was developed for motion pictures. This was a flexible film instead of rigid glass plate. It had the red, green, and blue in a mosaic pattern. And behind that was, of course, our silver nitrate. It was developed in 1932, and they stopped manufacturing it in the 1950s. We're going to skip how they manufactured this and move on to the next color process, the Technicolor process that should planted this method because it was superior. This might be the most interesting one. Let's go to 1940 at the Technicolor process. Let's meet Herbert Stan Frost Comstock and Herbert Karmish. Now it is time to look at their work. Interesting thing to note, with the early Technicolor process, strictly speaking, you don't need all three colors to reproduce a color image. You can get away with just red and green. However, this has some drawbacks. You couldn't really have anything blue in the frame, and as well as purple. And on top of that, you couldn't even have anything yellow in the frame. Yikes. And the colors lacked saturation and contrast. They were all this kind of a little flat looking. But the upside to this using red-green, is that it did have a good skin tones. This process was used up to 1928. Fast forward a bit to Walt Disney's Flowers and Trees. In 1932, they found a way to add a blue strip into the mix. The original reason they weren't able to do this is because, annoyingly, the red and blue light moves at the same speed inside the prism. Now, it's finally time to take a look at how they added in that blue strip. First, with the prism, we would spin off the green light. There were two films combined together, blue and red. The gold layer in the prism allowed the blue and the red light to move at slightly different speeds, allowing them to be separated. This process made it possible to produce a finer color negative. With this innovation, they were able to have an adequate color reproduction. The early free strip process had some drawbacks. The cameras used in this process were massive because they needed space for all that extra film and space for the prisms to split the light apart. These cameras were also extremely loud, so they had to add sound dampening material. When all instead was done, these cameras weighed as much as a motorcycle. A big motorcycle, like a Harley Davidson. Now, their early free strip process had some more drawbacks. It required an extraordinary level of light due to all the light loss through the prism. The light intake coming from the lens had to expose three rows of film, so that had to be split between those. And not to mention, the blue strip was behind the red strip, so even less light got to the blue strip, which limited exclusively to being used in a studio environment where the light could be controlled. The process went on. They later innovated and came up with a film that needed considerably less light, making it much easier to use, and meaning the film could be taken outside and used on an actual location instead of on a soundstage. However, this process still had a huge drawback. It still required a custom camera to use. This would be its undoing. Although the Technicolor process was technically superior, it did have color competitors that were cheaper and much easier to use, even though they technically had inferior colors to the Technicolor process, as well as needing a Technicolor crew from the Technicolor company to operate the cameras. I'm not going to explain how the Technicolor process works in great technical detail, because this is about the history of photo editing, not the history of video editing. The technical process behind it could easily be its own video. The other thing I will mention further about the Technicolor process is the dyeing process, because this transitions us into multi-channel mode and CMYK channel mode, and the Eastman color process. Before we move on to Eastman colors, I have to note one little fun fact. The free strip process actually lives on in the digital age. Broadcast cameras used for live television rely on free digital image sensors, recording red, green, blue. The camera reassembles these, producing a final color image, just like the free strip color process. This has superior looking colors to a single sensor camera, as well as, most importantly for broadcasting, excellent skin tones, as well as making compositing easier for broadcast television. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, with that fun little tidbit done, back to the demonstration, back to talking about multi and CMYK, the dyeing process, and last but not least, Eastman colors. There are other primary colors, and they're the opposite of red, green, and blue. We're dealing with negatives. The opposite of red is cyan. The opposite of green is magenta. And the opposite of blue is yellow. Quick thing to note, this process applies to the free strip color process, not the multi-pack Technicolor. Not going to go into that any further because it's not on topic. Just note that the multi-pack is different from the free strip color process I'm talking about. Once the blue, green, and red were dyed in their opposites, this produced a final color image. Multi and CMYK are a subtractive color process versus RGB, which is an additive color process. Meaning, in layman's terms, RGB relies on light being projected to reproduce color, versus multi or CMYK, which works by absorbing light and reflecting light to reproduce the color. Let's explore the difference between the additive color process and the subtractive color process by taking a closer look at Eastman colors. Film and digital photography use the concept of mixing colors together to make color images. Note that other filmmakers copied this method. Eastman color was developed in 1953. Eastman color was based on Aqua color process, but Eastman color was superior to the Aqua Velar color process. Note that Kodak went on to invent many different types of color film, and also note that many different types of color film existed alongside Eastman colors at this time, but most of them work extremely similar to the Eastman color process. Eastman color layered together 3 different film dyes. The first one was yellow, then magenta, then cyan. This allowed the unique luminosity values of yellow, magenta, and cyan to be captured. The silver nitrate layer would be washed away. When the film was developed, there were some processes that kept a bit of the silver nitrate to improve contrast and shadow detail. Many types of black and white photography came and went. However, the main constant was the silver nitrate. Both printing and projection, RGB relied on mixing colors together. This is why it's also called a screen process, because it requires light to be projected behind the image for it to be seen, versus multi or CMYK, which can also be projected, but works exclusively by absorbing and reflecting light, hence why it's used for printing. Here's an animated example to better illustrate. As you can see in the RGB, it's additive, and the center is white, and in the center of the multi and CMYK, it subtracts black, black being the absence of color and light. Both of these processes rely on capturing the unique luminosity of the color values. To better illustrate what I'm talking about, let's look at my autochrome versus a piece of slide film and a piece of regular film. Note that slide film records a positive image versus the 35mm film that records a negative image. As you can see, with the autochrome with no light behind it, it just looks like a big black bar of glass. And as well as the slide, because it is also a additive color process or screen process. 35mm film, where you can actually see an image with no light projected behind it, because this process works by absorbing light and reflecting light. Both RGB, multi, and CMYK can be projected, but you can't use CMYK or multi in a screen process due to the fact that it exclusively relies on light being projected through the image to display information. RGB is much better at changing the color values on the fly versus multi and CMYK, which rely on filtering colors to produce an image, versus RGB, where you can just alter the intensity of the light and the color to make a color image, which is why it's used in devices. But both of these color film processes rely on the exact same principle, capturing the luminosity value of each of those unique colors, in the case of Eastman color film, by absorbing yellow, magenta, and last but not least, cyan, and only allowing those bits of light to strike those bits of silver nitrate. A full-color reproductive image is able to be displayed. Here's a quick physical example to demonstrate how the subtractive color process works. As you saw in both the animated example and the physical example, the key is when these colors are mixed together, you get red, green, and blue, which is why both of these processes actually are able to work. Photoshop was meant to be intuitive to people who work with film photography. And this, like with film editors and manipulators, like with digital editors and manipulators, they were able to adjust the colors by adding the opposite colors. So when they went to go make prints, for example, if they wanted more blue in the image, they would put a blue filter in front of it, or a red, or a green filter. Let's look at the color balance to better illustrate. Let's say they wanted less blue in the image, so they would put a cyan filter in front of it. When they went to make the print on the enlarger, we'll talk more about how those work later. So you should have a burning question. I went over that the multi stands for cyan and magenta, but there's a K on top of the cyan and magenta. What's that about? The K is black. Well, I guess it's time to answer that question. In the Technicolor process, behind the red film, green film, and blue film, they would put a strip of pure black and white film. This bit of black and white film would improve contrast and shadow detail. The Eastman color process often left some of the silver nitrate left behind in the dye layers to help improve contrast and to have more shadow information in the details. This was often referred to as the key strip or the key layer or the key dye because it was key to improving contrast. And not to mention, black and white photography is the key behind all forms of color film photography. Without the black and white layer of silver nitrate, or the silver nitrate mixed in the dye layers, no color photography. And in the case of printing, saving on ink. This is where the C in CMYK comes from. So the K in the case of color printing is black. It should probably be CMYB, but hey, we call it CMYK. And now you know why the K is MY in K. You could technically print without the black cartridge, but you would use up way more color ink trying to make black because, remember, multi and CMYK are a subtractive color process, which means when you add all the colors together, you get black. So the black cartridge is added to save on color ink and, as stated before, to add contrast. One more thing to note. Let's take a look at this print up close. As you can see, these tiny little dots make up the image. This like the silver nitrate grains, and this like the pictures on your screen. Little color dots come together to display the image you're looking at right now. But you're probably wondering, why do all these color spaces exist? Let's take a look at this graphic. Technically speaking, RGB is not capable of displaying all the colors we can see. Multi and CMYK can actually represent more colors than RGB can. There's other color channels too, but they're beyond the scope of this video. This is why, after you're done editing, it's extremely important to change the color mode to CMYK before printing so the colors come out accurate. This is why the patent for the Pantone color system exists. This company sells swatch books. Let's click on the color swatch in Photoshop to explain why these swatch books exist and why the rest of all these color spaces exist. If we look, we have more than the RGB represented. As you can see, let me move the color picker around. As you can see, as I do this, the color value changes in those boxes. These swatch books exist so graphic designers and companies can make sure the colors on their monitor will match when they are printed. As you see, when I pull the color slider around, the values change in each of them. These color books must be replaced yearly because the colors will fade. These swatch books exist so whatever material the design printed on or logo, the colors will stay accurate across the different mediums. And those swatch books need to be replaced every year because those colors will fade, defeating the whole point of using the swatch book to determine to make sure the colors match. The one thing I want you to understand is that you have your primary colors such as red, green, and blue. And then you have your luminosity. This is how dark and how light your colors are. These colors work together with the luminosity information to produce rich, detailed colors. This is how digital cameras and printers and film cameras reproduce color. This method worked because it had the luminosity value of each of those primary colors, so it was able to be reconstructed. Being able to adjust the luminosity values of each of the colors is extremely important for editing and manipulation, as well as compositing, but we'll get into that more when we talk about the layer mask in part 3. First thing first, we're going to get into how they composited with black and white film photography, then how they went about compositing with color film. Well, this is the end of part 2. I hope you will join me for part 3.